Commander HFY stood before the massive viewing screen in his command center, watching the red warning lights flash across the star map like angry eyes in the darkness. His blue-scaled hands gripped the metal rail as he studied the data streaming in from the Outer Rim territories. The Void Swarm had broken through the quarantine zone again, and this time they were moving faster than ever before. The Kalari commander had fought in 37 major battles across the galaxy during his long military career. He had seen entire planets consumed by the parasitic creatures that made up the swarm, watched as civilizations that had stood for thousands of years crumbled in mere days. The creatures were relentless, adaptive, and utterly without mercy. They consumed everything living and turned it into more of themselves. A junior officer approached him with trembling hands, carrying a datapad that glowed with urgent messages. The young Thraxian's 6 eyes darted nervously as he spoke in the common galactic tongue. "Sir, High Command has sent new orders. They want to activate the human protocol." HFY turned his large head to stare at the officer. His golden eyes narrowed as he processed this information. The human protocol was something the Galactic Defense Coalition had created but never used. It was a desperate measure, a last resort when all other options had failed. The humans were a new species, barely 50 years into their membership with the Coalition. They had no real experience with galactic warfare. "Are you certain about these orders?" HFY asked in his deep, rumbling voice. The officer nodded quickly and handed over the datapad. The commander read through the official communication twice, making sure he understood every word. High Command was indeed ordering him to work with human forces for this mission. The humans lived on a small blue planet called Earth in a relatively quiet sector of the galaxy. They had joined the Coalition after their first contact with alien life, eager to learn and explore beyond their home system. Most Coalition members considered them primitive and weak compared to the established galactic powers. Their technology was basic, their ships were small, and they had never faced anything like the Void Swarm. HFY walked to his private communication console and activated the quantum link to Coalition headquarters. Within moments, the stern face of Admiral Kethfor appeared on the screen. The old Vulcani leader looked tired, his usually bright orange skin appearing dull and worn. "Commander HFY," the Admiral began without any formal greeting, "I assume you have received your new orders. The situation has become critical. The swarm has consumed the Beta Centauri system completely. We estimate they will reach the core worlds within 6 months if we cannot stop them." "Sir, with respect, why are we bringing in the humans now?" HFY asked. "They have no experience with this kind of threat. Their weapons and ships are decades behind our technology. What can they possibly contribute to this fight?" Admiral Kethfor was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Commander, the human military leaders have been studying our reports about the swarm for the past year. They have requested permission to join this campaign multiple times. Their tactical analysis of our previous engagements has been quite interesting. They seem to think differently about warfare than we do." The Admiral paused and looked directly into the camera. "More importantly, we are running out of options. The swarm adapts to our tactics faster than we can develop new ones. Perhaps a fresh perspective is exactly what we need." 3 days later, HFY stood in the main docking bay of Kepler Station, waiting for the human ships to arrive. He had spent those days reviewing everything the Coalition knew about human military forces. Their ships were indeed smaller and less advanced than Coalition vessels, but they appeared to be built for speed and maneuverability rather than raw firepower. The first human ship to dock was called the Valiant Dawn. It was roughly half the size of HFY's own vessel, but sleek and angular in design. As the docking clamps engaged and the airlock sealed, the commander straightened his military uniform and prepared to meet these new allies. The airlock opened with a soft hiss, and the first human stepped through. He was shorter than HFY by at least 2 feet, with brown hair and dark eyes. His skin was the pale pink color that seemed common among his species. Despite his small size, he carried himself with the confidence of an experienced warrior. "Commander." "Zexthai," the human said, extending his hand in what the commander knew was a human greeting gesture. "I am Captain Jake Martinez of the Terran Strike Force. Thank you for agreeing to work with us on this mission." Zexthai reached out and carefully grasped the human's small hand, trying not to apply too much pressure with his much larger fingers. "Captain Martinez, welcome to Kepler Station. I hope your journey was comfortable." Behind Captain Martinez came more humans, each carrying equipment and weapons that looked crude compared to Coalition technology. Zexthai noticed that despite their primitive gear, they moved with purpose and discipline. Their eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, taking in details and potential threats. As the humans settled into their temporary quarters on the station, Zexthai found himself wondering what these small, soft-looking creatures could possibly do against the nightmare that was the Void Swarm. He had seen the strongest warriors in the galaxy fall before those monsters. How could beings who looked so fragile hope to survive what was coming? The joint briefing room on Kepler Station buzzed with quiet tension as representatives from 12 different Coalition species gathered around the holographic display table. Zexthai stood at the head of the table, his blue scales catching the light from the tactical projections floating in the air above them. The humans sat together on one side, looking small among the towering forms of the other alien warriors. Captain Martinez leaned forward as the three-dimensional map of the Chorus 7 system materialized between them. The planet glowed red in the display, indicating full swarm contamination. Lieutenant Amy Brooks, the human tactical specialist, took notes on a simple paper pad while her colleagues used advanced digital devices. "The situation is straightforward," Zexthai began, his deep voice filling the room. Chorus 7 was a mining colony with approximately 50,000 inhabitants. The swarm arrived 6 days ago. Our reconnaissance probes show the entire surface is now covered with their biostructures. Standard protocol requires orbital bombardment to prevent further spread. The humans exchanged glances. Sergeant Ryan Cole, a stocky man with graying hair, raised his hand. "Commander, what about survivors? Have you confirmed that everyone on the planet is dead?" Zexthai paused, surprised by the question. "Sergeant, the swarm does not take prisoners. They consume all biological matter to fuel their expansion. Survival is not possible once contamination reaches this level." Amy Brooks looked up from her notes. "Sir, our analysis of previous swarm attacks shows a different pattern. The initial consumption phase typically lasts 72 hours. After that, they begin converting biomass into specialized forms. If there were any survivors in underground facilities or shielded areas, they might still be alive." The commander felt a slight irritation at being questioned by these newcomers. "Lieutenant Brooks, the Coalition has been fighting the swarm for over 200 years. Our protocols are based on extensive experience and data analysis." Captain Martinez stood and walked to the hologram, pointing at several areas on the planet's surface. "With respect, Commander, your protocols assume the swarm behaves rationally. Our studies suggest they might be more adaptable than your models predict. We would like to propose a different approach." "What kind of approach?" asked Subcommander Veltar, a tall insectoid warrior from the Zephyri species. His mandibles clicked with amusement as he looked at the small humans. Martinez touched his tablet, and the hologram changed, showing a detailed view of the planet's northern continent. "We send in small reconnaissance teams to gather intelligence before any bombardment. If there are survivors, we extract them. If not, we learn how the swarm has adapted and use that information for future engagements." The room erupted in discussion as various Coalition officers voiced their opinions. Most thought the human plan was too risky and complicated. Why risk valuable personnel when orbital bombardment could solve the problem quickly and safely? Zexthai raised his hand for silence. "Captain Martinez, your proposal would require landing teams to operate in fully contaminated territory. The swarm creatures are extremely hostile and adaptive. They can mimic the appearance of other species and use biological weapons that can corrupt our people within minutes. We understand the risks, Amy Brooks said quietly. But our preliminary analysis suggests that current coalition tactics might be giving the swarm exactly what it wants. Each time you destroy a contaminated world, you eliminate potential intelligence about their methods and evolution. Ryan Cole added, plus, if there are survivors, they might have learned something about swarm weaknesses during their time in hiding. That information could be invaluable. Zexthai studied the humans carefully. Their proposal was dangerous and went against everything the coalition had learned about fighting the swarm. Yet something in their confident manner made him pause. These creatures seemed genuinely convinced that their approach could work. Very well, he said finally. We will attempt a limited reconnaissance mission. 2 teams will make planetfall, 1 coalition squad led by myself, and 1 human squad led by Lieutenant Colonel Lisa Park. Our primary objective will be intelligence gathering, with survivor extraction as a secondary goal. 2 days later, Zexthai found himself strapped into the passenger compartment of a coalition dropship alongside Lisa Park and her human team. The lieutenant colonel was a lean woman with short black hair and intense green eyes. She checked her equipment one final time as they approached Chorus 7's atmosphere. First time working with humans, Commander? She asked as the ship began to shake from atmospheric entry. Yes, Lieutenant Colonel. I admit I am curious to see your methods in action. Zexthai tightened his harness as the turbulence increased. Lisa. Park smiled, but it was not a warm expression. I think you'll find we approach problems differently than most species. Humans have been fighting for survival since we first walked upright on our home planet. We learned a long time ago that sometimes the crazy plan is the only one that works. The dropship's pilot, a nervous Kalari named Jexton, spoke over the communication system. Commander, I'm detecting multiple swarm biosignatures approaching. Our position. They've spotted us. Through the small viewport, Zexthai could see dark shapes rising from the planet's surface, like a swarm of angry insects. The swarm's flying forms were twisted combinations of organic matter and corrupted technology, moving with unnatural speed and coordination. Evasive maneuvers, Zexthai ordered, but even as he spoke, he could see they were outnumbered 20-1. The coalition dropship was fast, but the swarm creatures seemed to anticipate every turn and dive. Lisa Park unbuckled her harness and moved to the pilot compartment. Jexton, can you get us to those mountain caves on the northern continent? Not with these things chasing us, the pilot replied as the ship shook from impact. We're taking too much damage. Then put us down in the forest valley about 10 kilometers from the caves, Park said calmly. We'll walk. Zexthai stared at her. Lieutenant Colonel, that valley is completely overrun with swarm ground forces. Landing there would be suicide. Lisa Park looked back at him with those intense green eyes. Commander, that's exactly why they won't expect us to do it. Sometimes the best hiding place is right under the enemy's nose. The dropship crashed through the canopy of twisted trees with a sound like breaking bones. Zexthai felt his body slam against the restraints as the vessel skidded across the forest floor, tearing through undergrowth that had been corrupted by swarm biomatter. When the ship finally stopped moving, an eerie silence settled over them. Emergency lighting cast red shadows throughout the passenger compartment. Lisa Park was the first to move, checking her team with quick efficiency. Sound off, people. Anyone hurt? Good to go, Colonel, came the responses from her 4 soldiers. Ben Hayes, a quiet man with pale blue eyes, was already at the emergency exit, listening for movement outside. Kate Fisher, barely 22 years old, gathered medical supplies with steady hands despite the crash. The other 2, Scott Miller and Tom Clark, checked their weapons and equipment. Zexthai struggled with his harness, his larger frame having taken more punishment during the crash. Pilot Jexton, What is our status? A weak groan came from the cockpit. The Kalari pilot was alive but badly injured, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Lisa Park moved to examine him while her soldiers secured the immediate area. The ship's navigation system is completely destroyed, she reported. We're about 15 kilometers from our target zone, but I can't tell you our exact position without working sensors. Ben Hayes opened the exit hatch carefully and peered outside. Colonel, you need to see this. Zexathai followed the humans out of the crashed ship and immediately understood the corporal's concern. The forest around them was no longer truly a forest at all. The trees had been infected by swarm biomatter, their bark replaced by pulsing organic material that glowed with a sickly green light. Thick tendrils hung from the branches like alien vines, and the ground beneath their feet felt soft and warm, as if they were walking on living flesh. This level of contamination should have taken weeks to develop, Zexathai muttered, studying the corrupted landscape. The swarm has been here for less than a week. Kate Fisher knelt beside one of the infected trees, taking readings with her scanner. Sir, the biomatter is still spreading. I can see it growing in real time. Lisa Park consulted her compass and pointed toward a distant ridge. We head northeast toward those hills. Stay close together and avoid touching anything that glows. Ben, you take point. Kate, watch our 6. As they began moving through the nightmare landscape, Zexthai noticed how differently the humans approached their situation compared to Coalition standard procedures. Instead of trying to avoid the contaminated areas entirely, they moved through, them with careful purpose, studying everything they encountered. Scott Miller stopped beside a cluster of swarm pods hanging from a corrupted tree branch. The pods were roughly human-sized and pulsed with internal movement. Colonel, these look fresh. Something's still alive inside them. Keep moving, Scott, Lisa Park ordered. We're not here to play scientist. But even as she spoke, one of the pods began to split open with a wet tearing sound. A pale arm emerged, followed by a human face that Zexthai recognized from the colony records. The man inside the pod opened his eyes and looked directly at them. Help me, the figure whispered. Please, help me get out of here. Zexthai started forward instinctively, but Ben Hayes grabbed his arm with surprising strength for such a small being. Don't, Commander. Look at his eyes. The Kalari commander looked more carefully and saw what the human had noticed immediately. The colonists' eyes were completely black, without any trace of iris or pupil. As they watched, the figure smiled with too many teeth. You cannot hide from us, it said in a voice that seemed to come from multiple throats. We smell your fear. We taste your thoughts. Kate Fisher raised her weapon, but the pod creature was already dissolving back into organic slime that dripped to the forest floor. Within seconds, there was no trace that it had ever existed except for the empty pod, hanging above them. How did you know? Zexthai asked Ben Hayes as they continued moving. The smell was wrong, the corporal replied without emotion. Humans have a specific scent when they're afraid or in pain. That thing smelled like rotting meat. They traveled for 3 hours through increasingly hostile terrain. The swarm biomatter grew thicker and more aggressive as they moved deeper into contaminated territory. Twice they had to detour around areas where the ground itself had become a living organism that reached out with grabbing tentacles. As the alien sun began to set, casting strange shadows through the corrupted canopy, Lisa Park called for a halt in a small clearing that seemed less infected than the surrounding area. We'll rest here for 2 hours, then continue under cover of darkness. Tom Clark set up a perimeter warning system using small motion sensors, while Scott Miller distributed rations that looked disappointingly simple compared to Coalition emergency supplies. Zexthai accepted the human food with curiosity, finding it bland but surprisingly filling. Colonel Park, he said quietly as they ate, your soldiers seem very calm for people surrounded by one of the most dangerous threats in the galaxy. Lisa Park chewed thoughtfully before answering. Commander, humans have been living with dangerous predators for millions of years. Our homeworld tried to kill us every single day. We learned to adapt or die. As if summoned by her words, a low howling sound echoed through the forest around them. It was answered by similar calls from different directions, creating a chorus of alien hunger that made Zexthai's scales bristle with instinctive fear. "Swarm hunters," he whispered. "They've found our trail." The humans moved with practiced efficiency, gathering their equipment and checking their weapons. Kate Fisher injected herself with something from her medical kit, while Ben Hayes seemed to become perfectly still, listening to sounds that Zexthai could barely detect. "How many?" Lisa Park asked. "At least 12, probably more," Ben replied. "They're trying to circle us, but they're not very good at staying quiet." The colonel smiled again with that cold expression Zexthai was beginning to recognize. "Well then, gentlemen and lady, it looks like we get to show our new alien friend how humans hunt." The swarm hunters emerged from the corrupted forest like living nightmares given form. Each creature stood nearly 8 feet tall on legs that bent wrong and moved with joints that seemed to be in impossible places. Their bodies were a twisted fusion of organic matter and stolen technology, with weapons that had been grown rather than built extending from their arms like deadly flowers. Zexthai raised his plasma rifle, targeting the closest creature as it bounded toward them across the clearing. But before he could fire, he noticed something strange happening around him. The humans had not formed a defensive line as coalition doctrine would dictate. Instead, they were spreading out in what looked like a completely random pattern. Ben Hayes moved to the left and dropped behind a fallen log, but he was not taking cover. He was positioning himself to flank the approaching enemies. Kate Fisher went right, using the twisted trees as concealment while she worked her way around to the creature's rear. Scott Miller and Tom Clark seemed to vanish entirely, melting into the shadows like ghosts. Lisa Park remained beside Zexthai, but even she was moving in ways that defied military logic. She stepped forward into the open, making herself an obvious target while the swarm hunters charged toward them with inhuman speed. "Colonel, what are you doing?" Zexthai shouted over the howling of the approaching monsters. "You're exposing yourself to enemy fire." "Trust the plan, Commander," she replied calmly, then spoke into her communication device. "Ben, you have 3 coming up your left side. Kate, 2 more heading for that cluster of pods behind you." The first swarm hunter reached the clearing and opened fire with bioweapons that spat acid and living projectiles. Lisa Park threw herself sideways, rolling behind a corrupted tree trunk while return fire erupted from positions Zexthai had not even known were occupied. Ben Hayes appeared from behind his log like a jack-in-the-box, his weapon firing in controlled bursts that dropped 2 swarm creatures before they could react to his presence. But what shocked Zexthai was how the humans seemed to know exactly where the other creatures would be before they appeared. Kate Fisher emerged from the tree line behind 3 swarm hunters, her rifle chattering as she eliminated them with precise shots to what appeared to be their vital areas. She had somehow identified the creature's weak points simply by observing them during their approach. More swarm hunters poured into the clearing from multiple directions, but the humans continued their impossible dance of coordination. Scott Miller materialized on high ground that Zexthai had not noticed before, providing covering fire for his teammates. Tom Clark seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing wherever the enemy was weakest and vanishing before they could respond. "How are they doing this?" Zexthai wondered aloud as he added his own firepower to the battle. The humans were outnumbered 2 to 1, but they fought as if they shared a single mind. They anticipated each other's movements, covered each other's blind spots, and struck at the enemy with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural. A swarm hunter broke through their perimeter and charged directly at Zexthai, its claws extended and acid dripping from its maws. The commander raised his weapon, but Ben Hayes was suddenly there, tackling the creature from the side and driving a combat knife into what passed for its neck. The human rolled away as the creature collapsed, already turning to engage the next threat. But Zexthai noticed something in the corporal's eyes that made his blood run cold. There was no fear there, no hesitation or doubt. Ben Hayes looked at the swarm creatures the same way a predator looks at prey. "Ben, incoming from your 9 o'clock," Kate Fisher called out, and the corporal spun to face a threat that was still hidden in the tree line. His shots found their target before the creature even emerged from cover. "Kate, fall back to position 3, Lisa Park ordered, and the young woman immediately began moving toward a location that had been predetermined by some communication Zexthai had completely missed. The battle continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The humans flowed around the battlefield like water, always appearing where they were needed most, and disappearing before the enemy could mount an effective response. They used the corrupted terrain to their advantage, turning the swarm's own biomatter against it. When the last creature fell, an unnatural silence returned to the clearing. The humans regrouped around their colonel with the same efficiency they had shown during the fight. None of them seemed particularly excited or relieved by their victory. They simply checked their equipment and prepared to continue the mission. Zexthai stared at them in amazement and growing unease. "How did you coordinate like that? You were separated by hundreds of meters, but you fought as if you were connected by neural links." Scott Miller looked up from reloading his weapon. "Sir, we've been training together for 3 years. We know how each other thinks and moves. But the timing, the positioning, it was perfect," Zexthai insisted. "No species can achieve that level of coordination without technological assistance." Lisa Park walked over to examine one of the fallen swarm creatures. "Commander, humans are pack hunters. We evolved to work together to bring down prey much larger and more dangerous than ourselves. What you saw tonight is just our natural instinct applied to modern warfare." She knelt beside the creature and began taking tissue samples with a small device from her kit. "These things are fast and strong, but they're individuals. They don't really work together. They just attack in groups. That makes them predictable." Ben Hayes joined her examination of the creature's corpse. "Plus, they're used to facing opponents who fight like them. Straight-up aggression, direct confrontation. They don't know how to handle an enemy that thinks tactically." Kate Fisher was scanning the area with her equipment, checking for more threats. "Colonel, I'm picking up a lot more biosignatures moving this way. We stirred up something big." "How many?" Lisa Park asked, standing and shouldering her pack. "Hard to say exactly, but at least 50, maybe more. They'll be here in 20 minutes. Zexthai felt his heart sink. 50 swarm creatures would be impossible to fight, even with the humans' strange tactical abilities. "We need to call for extraction immediately." Lisa Park looked at him with those cold green eyes again. "Commander, we're still 10 kilometers from our objective. The mission isn't complete." "Colonel, 50 creatures will overwhelm us regardless of our tactics," Zexthai protested. "We should withdraw and attempt this operation with a larger force. Or," Tom Clark said quietly, "we could make them come to us on our terms instead of theirs." The humans exchanged looks that contained entire conversations Zexthai could not understand. Finally, Lisa Park nodded and turned to him. "Commander, how would you feel about learning what happens when humans stop playing defense and start hunting for real?" The underground facility they discovered 3 hours later was worse than anything Zexthai had imagined in his darkest fears. The humans had led him through a maze of swarm-infested terrain, using paths that seemed to exist only in their collective imagination, avoiding the massive hunting party that was still searching for them in the corrupted forest above. The entrance to the facility was hidden beneath a cluster of biopods that pulsed with sickly light. Kate Fisher had detected the artificial structure with her scanners, buried under layers of organic growth that the swarm had used to conceal it from orbital observation. Research Station, Lisa Park identified as they made their way through corridors lined with twisted metal and living tissue. The colonists were trying to study the swarm when it arrived. Emergency lighting flickered sporadically, casting moving shadows that made everything appear to be alive and writhing. The air smelled of decay and something else that Zexthai could not identify, but which made his scales crawl with revulsion. They found the first survivor in what had once been the station's main laboratory. She was a young human woman, maybe 30 years old, huddled in a corner behind an overturned table. Her clothes were torn and stained, and her eyes had the wild look of someone who had seen too much horror. "Please," she whispered when she saw them. "Please, you have to help the others. They're still alive, but the things are using them for experiments." Ben Hayes knelt beside her, his voice gentle despite the hard expression on his face. "What's your name? How many survivors are there?" "I'm Dr. Susan Wells," she replied, gripping his arm with desperate strength. "There are maybe 20 of us left. The creatures, they took the others to the lower levels. They're doing something to them, changing them." Lisa Park studied a floor plan of the facility that was displayed on a cracked monitor. "Dr. Wells, what kind of research were you conducting here?" "We were trying to understand how the swarm converts biological matter," Susan explained. "We thought if we could learn their process, we might be able to develop a defense against it." Tom Clark, who had been examining the laboratory equipment, looked up with a grim expression. "Colonel, they've got swarm specimens down there, live ones, and from what I can see, they've been experimenting on both the creatures and the human prisoners." Zexthai felt his stomach turn as the implications sank in. "The swarm is learning from human research methods. They're using our own scientific processes against us." "It's worse than that," Dr. Wells said. "They're not just copying our methods, they're improving on them. The hybrid creatures they're creating are smarter and more adaptive than anything we've seen before." A distant sound echoed through the facility's corridors, something between a scream and a roar that made everyone freeze. It was followed by other sounds, mechanical humming, organic gurgling, and what might have been human, voices calling for help. Scott Miller checked his ammunition and looked at his colonel. "Ma'am, what are the rules of engagement for this situation?" Lisa Park was quiet for a long moment, studying the facility map and considering their options. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. It was colder, more distant, as if she was pulling something dark from deep inside herself. "The rules of engagement are simple," she said. "Anyone who is still human gets saved. Everything else gets killed. No exceptions, no hesitation, no mercy." She turned to Zexthai with an expression that made the alien commander take an unconscious step backward. "Commander, what I'm about to show you is going to violate several coalition protocols regarding the treatment of captured enemies and the preservation of scientific specimens." "Colonel, the coalition has very specific guidelines about," Zexthai began, but she cut him off. "The coalition has never faced anything like this," she said firmly. "Your guidelines assume that your enemies follow some basic rules of civilized behavior. The swarm doesn't follow any rules at all." Ben Hayes was already moving toward the corridor that led to the lower levels, his weapon ready and his eyes scanning for threats. Kate Fisher took point behind him, while Scott Miller and Tom Clark flanked Dr. Wells to protect her. As they descended deeper into the facility, the organic corruption became more extensive. The walls themselves seemed to be breathing, and veins of biomatter pulsed with alien light. The sounds from below grew louder and more disturbing. They found the first hybrid creature in what had been the facility's medical bay. It had once been human, but the swarm had fused it with their own biotechnology. Extra limbs sprouted from its torso, and its face was a nightmare fusion of human features and alien organs. Worst of all, enough of its original mind remained for it to recognize them. "Kill me," it whispered through a mouth that was no longer entirely human. "Please, kill me." Ben Hayes did not hesitate. His weapon fired once, and the creature's suffering ended. But Zexthai noticed that the human's hands were completely steady, and his expression never changed. They found more hybrids as they moved deeper into the facility. Some were so far gone that they attacked immediately, driven by swarm programming that overrode any remaining human consciousness. Others retained enough awareness to beg for death. The humans killed them all with the same cold efficiency. They did not debate the ethics of their actions or hesitate to end suffering when they found it. They simply did what needed to be done and moved on to the next horror. In the deepest level of the facility, they discovered the swarm's main breeding chamber. Dozens of pods lined the walls, each containing a human prisoner in various stages of conversion. Some were still completely human, while others had begun the terrible transformation into hybrid creatures. "Dear God," Dr. Wells breathed as she saw what had become of her colleagues, but the humans around her were not paralyzed by the horror. They were already working with brutal efficiency to destroy the swarm operation. Kate Fisher planted explosive charges on the bioconversion equipment, while Scott Miller and Tom Clark began systematically executing the hybrid creatures that were too far gone to save. Lisa Park found the facility's main computer terminal and began downloading all the research data, while Ben Hayes worked to free the prisoners who could still be saved. "Colonel," Zexthai said, watching the humans work with a mixture of admiration and growing fear. "How can you function in this environment? How can you make these decisions so quickly?" Lisa Park looked up from the computer, her green eyes reflecting the alien light of the swarm biomatter. "Commander, humans have been making these kinds of decisions for thousands of years. When survival is at stake, we don't have the luxury of moral debate. We do what works." She finished downloading the data and turned to her team. 2 minutes to extraction. Take only the survivors who can walk." As they prepared to leave the nightmare facility behind, Zexthai realized that he was beginning to understand why other species in the galaxy spoke of humans in whispered tones. It was not because they were particularly strong or advanced. It was because when the situation demanded it, they could become something that even their allies found terrifying. The final battle began at dawn, when the humans decided to assault the swarm's primary processing center directly. Zexthai watched in growing amazement and horror as Lisa Park outlined a plan that violated every principle of sound military strategy he had ever learned. "We're going to walk straight through the front door," she announced to the combined force of human and coalition troops that had assembled at their makeshift base camp. "No stealth, no subtlety, no clever tactics. We're going to make so much noise and cause so much damage that every swarm creature on this planet will come running to stop us." Captain Jake Martinez had arrived with reinforcements 3 hours earlier, bringing 2 more squads of human soldiers and enough firepower to level a small city. But even with the additional troops, they were still outnumbered by at least 100 to 1. "Colonel Park," Zexthai said carefully, "the processing center contains the swarm's primary breeding facilities and command structures. It will be defended by thousands of creatures, including the larger warrior forms we have not yet encountered." "Exactly," replied Ben Hayes, checking his equipment one final time. "That's why this plan will work. They'll be so focused on protecting their main base that they won't see the real attack coming." The real attack, Zexthai had learned, involved a small team of humans infiltrating the processing center through maintenance tunnels, while the main force provided a distraction above ground. It was the kind of desperate gamble that should have resulted in complete failure and the death of everyone involved. But as the battle began, Zexthai started to understand that human definitions of success and failure were very different from those used by other species in the galaxy. The first wave of swarm defenders came boiling out of the corrupted landscape like a living tide of nightmare. There were hundreds of them. The smaller hunter forms they had fought before, larger warrior creatures with armor like bioplating, and flying forms that swooped down from the infected sky like demonic birds. The human response was immediate and overwhelming. Jake Martinez had brought weapons that Zexthai had never seen before, devices that seemed to channel raw destruction in ways that defied conventional physics. But more disturbing than their technology was the way the humans used. They did not fight defensively, trying to hold ground or minimize casualties. Instead, they fought like predators who had been given permission to hunt without restraint. Every action was calculated to cause maximum damage and psychological impact on their enemies. Ryan Cole, the demolitions expert, had rigged explosives throughout the battlefield that detonated in sequence, creating a symphony of destruction that seemed designed as much to terrorize the swarm as to kill them. The creatures began to exhibit behavior that Zexathai had never seen before. They started to hesitate, to show what could only be described as fear. "How is that possible?" he asked Amy Brooks as they took cover behind a fallen tree that was still, burning from one of Cole's charges. "The swarm doesn't experience fear. They're driven by pure biological imperative." Amy reloaded her weapon with calm precision while explosions continued around them. "Commander, everything experiences fear when it faces something more dangerous than itself. The swarm just hasn't met anything more dangerous than they are until now." Through the chaos of battle, Zexathai caught glimpses of the infiltration team, led by Tim Walsh as they disappeared into the underground tunnels. Walsh was a staff sergeant who looked like he could be someone's grandfather, but his eyes held the same cold fire that Zexathai had learned to recognize in all the human warriors. The diversionary assault continued for 2 hours, with the humans steadily advancing toward the processing center despite overwhelming odds. They moved through the swarm defenders like a knife through flesh, cutting apart formations that should have been able to stop any conventional force. But what truly horrified Zexathai was not their effectiveness in combat. It was the way they seemed to understand their enemies better than the enemies understood themselves. They anticipated swarm tactics, exploited weaknesses that other species had never noticed, and turned the creature's own adaptability against them. Nancy White, the colonel in overall command of the human forces, coordinated the assault with the same cold efficiency that Zexathai had seen in all her subordinates. She gave orders that sent soldiers into situations that should have been suicidal, but somehow those soldiers always emerged victorious. "Colonel White," Zexathai said during a brief lull in the fighting, "how are your people doing this? How can they function so effectively in conditions that would break most trained warriors?" She looked at him with the same disturbing smile he had seen on Lisa Park's face. "Commander, you're asking the wrong question. You want to know how we can be so effective. What you should be asking is why we're holding back." "Holding back?" "We're still following coalition rules of engagement," she explained. "We're trying to preserve specimens for study, minimizing collateral damage, maintaining communication protocols. If we were fighting this battle the human way, it would have been over in 20 minutes. Before Zexathai could ask what she meant, explosions began erupting from inside the processing center itself. Tim Walsh's infiltration team had reached their target and begun their work. But what emerged from the underground facility was not the team Zexathai expected to see. The humans who climbed out of the tunnels looked like they had been through hell itself. Their equipment was damaged. Their uniforms were torn and stained with substances that might once have been blood, and their eyes held an expression that made Zexathai's scales crawl with instinctive fear. But they were smiling. Alan Cox, a private, who could not have been older than 25, walked calmly out of the burning facility while swarm creatures fled in panic around him. He carried a device that pulsed with bioenergy, something that had clearly been taken from the swarm's own technology and turned against them. "Package delivered," he reported to Colonel White with the same tone he might have used to announce the completion of a routine training exercise. "The hive mind is experiencing some technical difficulties." As if summoned by his words, a sound emerged from the processing center that Zexathai had never heard before. It was the sound of thousands of swarm creatures screaming in unison, not with rage or aggression, but with something that could only be described as terror. The remaining swarm forces began to retreat, abandoning their positions and fleeing toward the contaminated zones of the planet. But the humans did not let them go. They pursued the fleeing creatures with methodical precision, hunting them down and eliminating them with the same cold efficiency they had shown throughout the entire mission. Colonel White, Zexathai said as they watched the final phases of the battle. "What did your infiltration team do down there?" "They showed the swarm what it feels like to be prey," she replied. "Humans have been hunted by things bigger and more dangerous than ourselves for millions of years. We learned how to be afraid, and more importantly, we learned how to make other things afraid of us." As the last of the swarm creatures were eliminated and the processing center burned behind them, Zexthai found himself alone with his thoughts. The humans were celebrating their victory with quiet satisfaction, checking their equipment and preparing for extraction as if they had just completed a routine training exercise. But Zexathai was not celebrating. He was thinking about what he had witnessed during the past few days and what it meant for the galaxy. The humans had not just defeated the swarm. They had done something that no other species had ever accomplished. They had made the ultimate, predators afraid. Later, as he sat in his quarters aboard the evacuation ship, Zexthai began writing his after-action report. He struggled to find words that would convey to Coalition Command what he had learned about their new human allies. How could he explain that the humans were not just another warrior species to be added to the Coalition's military forces? How could he make them understand that humanity represented something entirely new and potentially terrifying in galactic civilization? The humans could become monsters when necessary, but they never lost sight of what they were fighting to protect. They could embrace darkness without being consumed by it, and that made them the most dangerous species in the galaxy. In the end, he wrote only the essential facts. The mission had been successful, the swarm forces had been eliminated, and he requested human support for all future operations against similar threats. But he knew that no report could truly capture what he had witnessed. The day he faced true terror was indeed the day he fought alongside humans. Not because they were monsters, but because they could choose to become monsters while remaining perfectly human. And that choice, more than any weapon or technology, was what made them truly terrifying.